in Glasgow and Aberdeen between 2006 and 2008-9. And we evaluated those projects on the instructions of the Scottish Government, who paid both for the pilots and also for the evaluation process, which I undertook with a colleague at Aberdeen, but also with DTZ, who provided economic consultancy to help us look at the economic comparisons between the dispute resolution process that was offered and litigation itself. And there's obviously quite a lot of material, and I won't go over it all. It's still all publicly available on the Scottish Government website. But Charlie had asked me in particular to look at what do we know about what the courts are hoping for when they refer cases to mediation, and also what do we know about consumer views. So what I have is some information from that project, and we need to remember that that project was before the simple procedure was introduced. It was in the days when all low-value claims were considered by sheriffs, but many of those sheriffs were employed on a part-time basis, so they were practicing solicitors or advocates who came into the courts on a sessional basis. And quite often, courts used those sheriffs to deal with the lower value claims, which meant that there was a bit of a moving target of the judges who were dealing with the cases. Now, the pilot was intended to be for cases of all values in the civil courts, but as it played out, only small value cases were referred into the mediation process. And across the two courts, over a 2 and a bit year period, there were 138 cases referred to mediation. So that was a small sample of the cases in court overall, but there were some clear messages emerging about what were the triggers for the court to refer cases to mediation, other than simply the existence of a pilot, and also what the users' experiences were. And I think some of those can usefully flow through into the simple procedure world, but also into the wider dispute world. Here we're looking at the court end. I'm very conscious that mediation has a very significant role in lots of other contexts, but here we're looking at its interaction with courts. Well, put briefly, what the triggers were for the sheriffs to refer cases to mediation was that they genuinely wanted to see this situation resolved by the parties. Now, some of that was an instinctive thing for certain sheriffs. They thought that was a good thing. Others could see it as something that would make the courts look better because the parties could achieve some satisfaction from being involved in the resolution process. And that indeed was the case. There were satisfied parties, and that did reflect back on the court. But it certainly was the case that, as Charlie mentioned this morning, once people experience mediation or experience it having been successful in a certain situation, then they're drawn to use it again. So we found that because there was an established mediation process in Edinburgh Sheriff Court, then some of these part-time sheriffs who'd already been in Edinburgh and knew about the success of the project there were inclined to refer cases to it if they were sitting in Aberdeen or Glasgow. And sheriffs who could see that it was being successful in certain cases were then keen to refer again. It has to be said, in low-value cases, the lawyers are also, if involved at all, less resistant to those cases coming out of the court system because there's limited fee scope for the lawyers in these cases anyway. But a good number of the cases, there were no lawyers involved. But at the time in Aberdeen, there was a lay in-court advisor funded through the Scottish Legal Aid Board and the Citizens Advice Bureau. And that lay advisor was very keen to ensure that parties knew about the mediation option and got involved. And so the referral rates in Aberdeen were significantly boosted by the presence of that in-court advisor. And I think that's been played out in subsequent research undertaken by Blake Stevenson in the mid-2000s. So clearly the idea about mediation is that it empowers the parties to reach a settlement, but within the court context, the sheriffs in many, but certainly not all instances, had a similar aim. Some sheriffs, I think this still prevails in certain places, felt that because the case had been brought into court, then the parties wanted it determined by the court, and that therefore they would be fobbed off if they were referred to that other process. That's certainly not how parties felt or feel. And I think as time wore on, that became less of a concern, but it still persists in certain members of the judiciary, although training and, as Charlie says, the summary sheriffs moving up through the ranks all help to address that. So what do we know about the consumers' views? So we got these by not only the satisfaction forms completed for the mediation service, and the mediation service was a limited company set up by a commercial mediation provider, and they organised the administration of the service, and largely the mediators were volunteers, because in the low value cases it was guaranteed that no fee would be charged. So we had their evaluation forms, but we also surveyed the participants, surveyed all the people who were involved in mediated cases, and we surveyed a similar sample of people who didn't get involved in mediation, but were in the same type of case. We also observed the court end of some of the cases, and we observed some of the mediations. What happened largely was that mediations were conducted off the premises, but quite a number were conducted by phone. And that was particularly helpful in the Aberdeen Sheriff Court area, where there's quite a large geographical catchment, much of it rural, and there's also a significant, or there was at the time, a significant population employed offshore, who would be 2 weeks working offshore, 2 weeks onshore, and they were able to communicate more easily by phone than by attendance. There was a 77.5% settlement rate across the period of the pilot and across the two courts. And something I think that often gets forgotten is that the implementation of the outcomes of the mediation was 90%. So not only did people be empowered to settle on terms that suited them, they actually followed through. Whereas in litigation, often you'll get a ruling from the court, but that's just the start of it. Then it has to be implemented afterwards. And the parties really valued the fact that they were coming to a conclusion in the settlement. And I think that's an important thing for us to bear in mind. So the key positive things the parties found was that they felt someone was listening. There was an early opportunity to settle the case. And in all the cases, even the ones not mediated, 97.5% of the parties wanted a speedy process. There was an improved understanding, they felt, of the other side, although on a slightly negative tone. Some people felt that the other side benefited more from being in the mediation than they did. although that didn't necessarily undermine the settlement. They just felt that maybe the other side was more needy of being heard, and perhaps both sides would think the same about the other. They certainly thought it was more humane, simple, and less stressful than the court context. Some took the chance to discuss related issues, not just the ones in the particular case. So we had one neighbour dispute about payment for a bill for a common repair, and it emerged in that mediation that there was another forthcoming common repair. So the parties just agreed how they would deal with that one as well. So it extended outside the scope of the case. And they certainly felt they were treated respectfully and professionally by the mediator. The main negative point about the mediation that some parties commented about, and I'm not sure how this works in the clinic, is that they were being encouraged to settle the case with no expenses due to or by either party. And I think in simple procedure, that would be the norm anyway. But some of them felt that, yes, there had been a settlement, but they had been in the right, and it would have been more appropriate for them to have some contribution towards their court costs. One of the key things we found was that there was a low level of knowledge about mediation. So especially amongst those who didn't go to mediation, it was largely because they hadn't heard about it. And information flow was a key issue for us, and it was what stopped in the mediation pilot it penetrating the higher value cases, because they tended to be handled by lawyers, and the lawyers were the conduits of information. Some would have been interested, but in many cases there simply wasn't a convenient point in the case at which the information could be passed on. So there was a high level of satisfaction with outcomes and process in the mediation, and that was consistent with an Ipsos Mori poll that had been conducted with civil court users in 2009. I think one of the difficulties that was brought to the fore by this research and other research is that a lot of what happens in litigation depends on assumptions that people know what litigation can and can't do, know what it costs or doesn't cost. And we found that people who went to mediation assumed that litigation would have been very expensive in the long run. Our economic analysis showed that it was cheaper to take cases along the mediation route, but that had to be based on notional figures as to the cost of litigation, because it's not something that's routinely available. As anyone who's trained in mediation knows, assumption is one's greatest enemy. We have to ask the questions and then build resolution on the basis of the information that we gather. And I would say that's a key point for the development and advancement of clinics going forward. Clinics provide a basis for evidence because you're generating mediated cases. And if you provide a high quality service, it provides more evidence of satisfaction. The option of mediation becomes more normalized and expected. And of course, the simple procedure rules have assisted with that. So I'll stop there, and no doubt we'll have questions later.
Thank you very much, Margaret. That's great. So if it's okay, we'll move straight on to Sue's session. And again, just a reminder, if everyone could put any questions in the chat box, and we'll come to them at the end. Okay. All right, Sue, are you ready to go?
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you, Margaret. It's really interesting to hear the reverberating themes. I've been particularly looking at small claims mediation with a view to what's happening in England and Wales. And I just wanted to really pick up today, particularly on three main themes. I also carried out research in the early 2000s, and I still feel some of that is relevant today, but I want to move in my presentation between what happened in the past in terms of the empirical research that I've carried out in court-based mediation, and also compare that to sort of what's going on today. So I have focused on small claims in civil cases as my research, and in England and Wales, the current limit for small claims is £10,000. We also have a small claims mediation service, so that if cases are referred, when cases are filed with the courts, then they can be referred to a telephone mediation system, which is run free of charge by Her Majesty's Court Service. And so that is a particular programme that's run by the courts. And that service has been running for a number of years, but last year in 2020, the court service decided to run a pilot. So previous to that, if people had wanted mediation, they had to opt into the mediation service. But last year they changed it to an opt-out service. And that meant if people wanted to mediate, then they got referred automatically, even if they wanted, or even if they didn't want to mediate. However, what they found in that service, and these were any cases that were up to a value of £500, that even though parties had to opt out, they just had a higher rate of opting out. So what they found was that parties tended to opt out rather than the previous position of opting in, and they still ended up with the same number of cases going to mediation. So by changing the rules around whether people should mediate or not, so that it became a little bit more difficult not to mediate, they still found that more people were, the same number of people were mediating as they had done previously. So I think that's quite interesting in terms of also what Margaret was saying about the public understanding of mediation. So I wanted to say a little bit about that. And I also wanted to say a little bit about suitable cases, because when I talked about my research that I've done previously, I get asked the question, well, what type of cases are suitable for mediation? How can we decide? Because it'd be much easier if those cases were the ones that we referred to mediation. And then finally, I just wanted to pick up on what is a successful mediation and say a little bit about that. So I wanted to start with what does the public understand by mediation? And I had a look on the court service website before coming along to this conference today. And what it says there is that the small claims mediation service that the courts operate for the public is free. It helps resolve cases relating to financial disputes. It's an alternative to taking a claim through the formal court process. It says on the website, you work with a trained Her Majesty's Courts and Tribunal Service mediator who will help you identify issues and work together to resolve them. It says the benefits of mediation are less expensive, quicker and confidential. What happens? A mediator explains how the session will work, listens to each side and tries to reach agreement, impartial, confidential, and not to try and force you to find a settlement. And I don't know about you, but that doesn't really make me think that I want to rush and do a mediation, whatever it might be. And some of the wording within what's being said there in terms of not trying to force you, even the use of the word force is quite concerning. If you're thinking you might go to court, I might be better in front of a judge in terms of this other process where I don't really know what it is. Also, the benefits of mediation, it stresses that it's less expensive, quicker and confidential. Now, it may be that less expensive is appealing and also quicker is appealing. Confidential, I don't know, because, you know, as a member of the public, I might feel that going to court is pretty confidential anyway. I'm not likely with my low value small claims to get put all over the front pages of the newspapers necessarily. So I'm not really sure what that means. I feel that sometimes the description of mediation, especially in relation to courts, can be very descriptive, lawyerly, and is written from the perspective of either a lawyer or a mediator in terms of what they feel the benefits of mediation might be. And research can really help us to understand what it is that people need when they want to go to mediation. So I think in order to be able to write effectively about why people should mediate, we need to understand from those who are going through the process or who are choosing not to go through the process, why that is the case. So as I say, I think some of the wording in the court service website is currently quite negative. And I've found, you know, in my research, when you go and talk to people about mediation, that they use words like, it's less grief, it's just taken a lot of weight off my mind. It is about what it gives you rather than the fact of settlement or the result. It's the process itself that I think is really important. So I think there's an issue there about what the public understand about mediation. I think that's something that we could spend a little bit more time on if this is something that is important, which I think it is. Another quite difficult question is the question about suitable cases for mediation, and how do we decide which sort of cases work better than others, which types of cases. As I've already mentioned, I conducted research on small claims mediation at Exeter County Court. It was in 2004. We ran a project where we reviewed case files, conducted interviews and observed mediation. We also did follow-up interviews with parties after they'd attended a mediation a few weeks later, just to see how it had felt and, you know, what their reflections were on the process. Mediation was free at the time. It was paid for by the Ministry of Justice, through the Ministry of Justice, and the cases would last up to 1 hour. So mediation would last up to 1 hour, but very short and snappy mediations carried out generally by lawyers, because this was run through the local law society. The maximum value for small claims at the time was £5,000. What we found in terms of our research was that it was very difficult to categorise claims into types. So we found that 129 mediations were defined into 19 different categories by the court when they're entered on the court system. So that might be landlord and tenant, building disputes, sale of goods, those sorts of categories. But there was another 124 cases that were not categorised because they crossed over into more than one category. And we know when people go to court, and this is reflected in small claims, that very often it's a symbol of a chaotic life to an extent, that you've probably got a debt issue or one type of claim that isn't very easily classified into a specific box and might cross over into many different areas. And so actually trying to find or trying to define a claim when it is about people's lives and the intersection of people's lives can be very difficult to do. So once again, I think sometimes with mediation, it's about the process. It's not about where we're trying to get to with the process. So how do we flag the cases so we learn what works? In the piece of research we carried out, we found that success depended very much on the value of the claim. And in terms of the process that we observed, it was much more likely that cases, so these were cases up to £5,000, as I've said already, but it was the cases under 1,500 that were more likely to settle than higher value claims. And that was in this piece of research with the type of mediation that was being carried out. Now, there may be all sorts of reasons for that, but it wasn't that we could really easily define it by case type. It was easier to define it by the value of the claim. And that didn't mean that there weren't really low value claims that weren't completely intractable either, because sometimes people felt very passionately about very small amounts of money and just were not prepared to settle. And then I think another factor in terms of success in mediation, and once again, I think if you go to the court service, then what they're really interested in is settlement and moving cases out of the court system, settling them quickly and satisfactorily. But is that what success is? And do you actually need to settle in order to have a successful mediation? In my research at Exeter County Court, in the similar statistics to Margaret, most of the cases that went to mediation settled. So roughly sort of 70% would settle. They were referred in person to a mediator by a judge on the day of the small claims hearing. And the parties very much felt, therefore, they had had a day in court. So they got to court. Sometimes it was, I just wanted to see him sitting in the waiting room, squirming and worrying about going in front of that judge. And that was enough for me. So sometimes just being part of the process and integrated into the process was enough. In terms of the system of small claims telephone mediation that's currently carried out by the court service, even if settlement isn't achieved, having observed some of those telephone mediations, the mediator can help the parties to focus on the issues in the case that will be most pertinent when they reach a hearing. And that's the sort of support that Charlie might have been referring to earlier when he talked about activist mediators, that having somebody there who's listening, who's able to give you some direction and sort of say, well, if you go to court, you might want to just mention that, or be able to give you that sort of support, can be really helpful. So many of the parties that I have spoken to in mediation have found that the opportunity to sit down with a mediator who can help manage an informal conversation with the other side and to talk about the dispute can be very beneficial in a variety of ways. So how can we better capture the benefits of mediation, that it isn't just about percentages of settlement? So yeah, just to finish, I suppose then the quality of data is really important. It's important to be clear as to our objectives, as to what we want to get out of research. There's lots of different perceptions of a process and its value. And I think, you know, at the moment, there's a real emphasis on users. And so users of court, users of mediation, having a view as to what they think, I think is really important. The government have just announced a data first programme where they're looking to link data sets with researchers and academics to help understand patterns better of people going through the justice system. And at the moment, that's mainly focused on crime, because I think that so little data is collected in relation to civil cases. And I think this is going to be important going forwards, because I know that the government are looking to maximise the use of mediation in the future and to deal with the huge backlog of cases that are currently being generated by COVID and the difficulty that that results in terms of access to the courts. We need to think about how online processes and online mediations might contribute to a wider project, and how research on online processes might influence, change, or redirect mediation in a number of ways. I'm also wondering, in terms of mediation clinics, and really importantly, Strathclyde had a great influence on me and helped me when I was setting up a clinic with my own students at Exeter. And I think the experience of clinics themselves and how they might input in terms of the wealth of data and experience that's currently being generated in order to inform where we go in the future. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Sue. That was great. Thank you both. We've got a few kind of comments and questions in the chat function, so I'll just go through them, but we do have some time, so if anyone wants to stick some extra questions there, please do. So one question, I think, was probably more directed towards Sue, but I imagine maybe both of you could kind of comment, is might suitability be determined by the party's mindset more than the type or case or value? Sorry, the type of case or value. Would either of you like to comment on that?
I'd like to come in there. I think in terms of the research, and I have observed a lot of mediations in a lot of different settings, very much sort of civil mediations. I'm really interested in small claims, but in terms of watching mandatory mediation in other court systems and other jurisdictions, it's very interesting too in terms of mindset. But I think in terms of the research that I've carried out, it's interesting that parties have gone along thinking they're going to sit before a judge. A judge has then said, look, why don't you just have a chat with the mediator, because, you know, I'm running late, or I think it might help you. And so then they've gone in front of a mediator, not really known who a mediator was, but found it very useful. And then in the follow-up research, they found that actually they thought it was a very useful process. A lot of what currently I think is happening is that parties are asked on direction questionnaires about mediation, opting in or opting out, and they don't really understand what it is. And so I think that in terms of that mindset, it can be quite difficult for parties to really know what they're going into at all. I mean, I've sat in on mediations where they've asked when they can bring their witnesses. What time in the mediation will my witnesses be allowed to come in? And so, you know, I think it's that really clear understanding as much as we can beforehand of what the process actually is that's important.
Yes, I mean, I would agree with that. I've not sat in on mandatory mediations, but I've sat in the court while cases have been referred to the in-court mediator there and then. And one thing that strikes you these were at first callings of these low value cases is that people had come along all geared up for that to be the hearing that would determine their case, despite the fact that, you know, there was information in the court papers that this wouldn't be the determinative hearing. But people would come up psyched up for that, very nervous, even though they might be professional people but not involved in this sort of context before, and being then referred to a mediator who would simply listen and try to help them formulate what was in their minds, and if not settled, then at least narrow the questions that were under dispute. People found particularly valuable. So that seemed to me to give the benefit of the court sort of badging the process, but also take away actually a big disappointment for those parties that if they did stay on the litigation track, it was going to be quite far down the line before the case was actually determined.
Thank you both very much. There was another question that came in about suitability. I wonder if you could comment on that. So the question is, I wonder why value is considered in any way a determinant of suitability. Many small claims bristle with difficulties and many large claims are legally at least actually very simple. Do you have any comments on that one?
I'm happy to go first, Margaret. I think that the research that I did was commissioned by the Ministry of Justice, and that cases, when they go through, or when you file a claim, they're filed in relation to the amount of value of the claim. So small claims is up to £10,000, and you have fast track, multi-track, and they're all classified in terms of the amount of the claim. And so the research, what the courts, and I also have done research, mediation research in fast track and multi-track cases. And I agree absolutely that it's actually about the type, it's about the nature of the people, I think, sometimes going to the case. And like Margaret says, their sort of, their viewpoint of how successful they think they're going to be, rather than necessarily the amount of the claim, because you can be very intractable and at odds with somebody over a very small amount of money. But that was just the way that the courts organised themselves, and that's why they wanted to look at the claims on the basis of value, because it would inform them in terms of working out what the investment was. And I suppose that's the important bit, is that if mediation is an expensive process and the value of the case is quite small, how are we going to pay for it? Whereas in a fast track or multi-track case, then you can make that investment, because obviously as part of a very much more expensive claim, you might save a lot of money by going to mediation. That isn't necessarily the case with small claims, and therefore the issue for the courts is, what is this worth actually financing? And we need to know the value of the claim in order to determine that.
We found that the users that we talked to, they felt their cases weren't legally complex, that they were at the court simply to get something sorted out. Now, it may have been that those of us who are lawyers, if we'd picked over it, would have thought, yes, it was legally complex, but in a sense, that doesn't really matter. What they wanted was to get their case sorted. And I think where there's a very different environment is in family mediation, where the courts usually recognise that they're not the best place to deal with some of the more relational issues that are in the dispute. And family mediation also has that backdrop of fairly clear legal boundaries about division of property and things like that. So there's been a steady flow of family cases to mediation at all values, because of that sort of consensus that there's something to be gained from talking about things, especially things in relation to children that will persist until they are adults, as Charlie mentioned earlier. So personally, I think there's scope in all value cases, but if you're looking at the court interface, then that's where there need to be clear rules and also a clear funding system. Personally, I think that in low value claims, it would be easy to divert part of the justice budget into a free low value mediation system, but you have to be careful how you set it up. The higher value cases, because they belong to the parties and the parties have to fund them, then they need to have a voice in all of this. They need to be part of the decision-making process about going to mediation.
Thank you. I think the next question kind of links a little bit onto what you were just talking about there. Do you think the shorter 1 hour mediations affect the outcomes of the mediations?
If I can start, the Scottish ones were generally assumed to be 2 hours, but they could go on for longer. I think most of the mediators would have said that the discussion picked up pace towards the end of that period, and also that parties were actually craving the activist approach that Charlotte was talking about. They wanted someone to provide them with some parameters, not in relation to their own case, but how things happened normally. But I've no experience of the 1 hour limit.
Some of the mediations that I observed were even shorter than that. And I think it really just depends on the parties. So I agree absolutely with Margaret that sometimes having a deadline can be a good thing and that it focuses minds. And it was very useful to see that. But sometimes I think parties just need longer in order to work through issues. And it really depends what you're trying to do. And, I teach mediation. I've spent a lot of time looking at mediation theory, and I've also done some restorative justice work. And I think depending on what you're trying to achieve, and more of an investment in understanding the other party and working out where you're coming from and where you want to go to in terms of your relationship, can be really important. And that doesn't just apply to families, it applies to business people working together and sort of finding mechanisms to enable them to work together. So yeah, I mean, I think you can be quick and dirty in a way and resolve a dispute and come to a resolution, but that isn't necessarily giving you the sort of quality of mediation that might be more useful in the longer term. So it really depends what you're trying to do. If you're offering something for free, then probably it's going to be shorter and not the sort of quality that I'm talking about. But if we could find a way of encouraging parties to then think about, well, hey, this is useful, maybe I should be doing more of this in other ways, and that might be something to go on with. I see, if you're looking at sort of the way some online systems have been developed, that they're built on sort of mediation or ADR principles around thinking about empowering and sort of settling. So I think it's using processes in different ways. It isn't necessarily just about time. So it wasn't a straight answer.
Thank you. Our next question is about promotion of ADR and mediation, and whether you have any opinions on the best approach going forward and how it can be promoted. And related to that, there's a question about the expert group in Scotland, the recommendation to create the Early Dispute Resolution Office, and if you have any views on that particular suggestion.
Can I maybe chip in first? And in relation to information, I think somebody mentioned either in the comments or in an earlier session that information is often written by lawyers or mediators who have two distinct but overlapping languages, which are not necessarily the language of any of the people who come to court as users. And there's been some interesting evaluation done of court-annexed mediation schemes in the east coast of North America, and there was an evaluation done by the Harvard Business School, and the main thing that came out of that was that the information was written by lawyers and mediators in their language, and it needed to be written in everyday language for court users. So I think there should be a lot more information, but I was very struck by Sue's comments about what's on the website for the low value claims in England and Wales, because that is off-putting language potentially. So time needs to be spent on getting the message done in the right way. And I can't remember what the second part of the question is, but I'll hand over to Sue, and then I'll maybe remember after that.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. And I think this is where research is so important. It cuts to the heart of what we're talking about. But I think if mediation is a good thing, then we need to spend a lot more time on, and I think there's a question coming up later on about mandatory mediation. And having done some work in North America, especially in Canada, at the time when mandatory mediation was introduced, that I think sometimes it focuses minds if mediation is mandatory, because then lawyers need to learn to understand how to mediate and what it is. The processes need to be able to be illustrated, put over, and everyone needs to understand it if it's part of a system. Whereas at the moment, I think it's very much a sort of add-on to what we do. It's like an extra. And I think if it was to be integrated, then that would focus minds a lot more. I think at the moment it's not really something whereby it's seen as of massive import, but I think that is changing. And I think there was another question. I don't know, Sophie, if you wanted to repeat.
Yes.
I think it was probably more for Margaret, because it was on Scotland.
Yes, it was about the expert group's recommendation to create an early dispute resolution office. So basically, what are your opinions on that?
I mean, my opinion is very positive. I would like to see that available, but for all civil cases, not just for low value cases. Again, if you look at North America, there's a trend in a lot of states to train court staff in dispute resolution so that they are able to provide that service and able to provide information. And I think if it was embedded in our process in Scotland, that would be a major thing. And I think certainly the court administrative staff, even if they weren't the people who were staffing it, from the time of my research and conversations since then, would like to see something that provides that additional information within the context of the lifespan of the case. So I'm very supportive of the expert group report, and I know that there's work ongoing with the government. There's a national group working on that. But as we know from what Margaret Mitchell said this morning, any legislation has a very long lead-in time. Even court rule changes have long lead-in. So I think what everyone hopes to be looking at the moment is how things can be moved forward without getting caught up in that very lengthy process. But maybe we just have to be patient along that line, but keep trying to fuel the mediation practice that is happening, whether through the clinics or otherwise.
Thank you. We've got a question about physical hearings, or the absence thereof at the moment. And the comment is that many in-court mediators anecdotally observe that an initial court hearing can be a big reality check for inexperienced litigants and encourages them to mediate. So did that form part of either of your findings?
Yes, absolutely. And the whole idea, I think, when you're in dispute, whatever dispute it is, you know, that idea that if you're going to go to court, you must be right, otherwise you probably wouldn't be there. So that sort of is part of your mindset. And I think a lot of what we've been talking about today is about a culture shift, and the whole idea of, dispute resolution, that it's not really about going to court, it's actually about finding solutions. So being more solution orientated to people's problems. So I think, if we can move away from that language of a day in court and the very lawyerly way of thinking about disputes, and actually think more about how we're actually helping society and people to find solutions to problems, then mediation, I think, would come far more to the fore.
I agree, although I think there's maybe a slight movement in some parts of Scotland under the simple procedure already, even before the COVID impact, because the role of the summary sheriff in simple procedure is really to push the parties. If it's a disputed case, they get into bother if they push on undefended cases. But in disputed cases, they can push back at the parties by email correspondence through the clerk of court. So, and before they even allow there to be any kind of presence in the court. So I think we're moving, but not all parts of Scotland are using the simple procedures in the same way. And in some respects, I see the move to online, which kind of dominates civil at the moment, as something of a fire break from the old process and chipping away around the edges of the old process, and a new world created to sit on the technology and the focus on what courts can and can't do and the other options.
Thank you. We've got another comment or question about the outcome of mediations and about settlement. And the comment is, I completely agree with Sue's point that success is more complex than settlement or not. Could you expand a bit more on any other outcomes either of you were able to look at in your research, particularly in terms of relationship or communication changes?
Yeah, I mean, there's some lovely examples of where I've sat in on mediations, and you think, and especially if they're short, where both parties are very, very aggressive at the beginning of the process, and you think, how on earth are these people going to be able to resolve their problem? And they do talk it through by the fact that the mediator encourages them to listen to each other, that sometimes, you know, we've had people leaving the mediation room and together saying, right, you're going to give me that money now, Fred, we're going to go along to the cash point, just give it me now, and then we're going to have a drink. And it's just like they suddenly go from really aggression to actually finding a way through it. And really that's what they both wanted, was to find a solution that repaired their relationship. It wasn't really about the settlement. And, you know, obviously there's other examples of where sort of physically they've said, well, look, you know, we'll negotiate something, but it's going to be more about our working together in the future. So there's all sorts of things. I did have a quite heartbreaking case that I sat in on, which was very minimal amount of funding, but it was two neighbours arguing about some dresses that one of them had taken to, somebody had lent some dresses to the other one, and they'd taken them to the second-hand shop, and then they'd fallen out. And it wasn't about money at all. It was purely about friendship, and it was irretrievable, really, because they couldn't get to the point of actually being able to talk to each other, and it had just gone too far. So I think there's another point in there about the timing of mediation, whatever the value of the claim is.
Yes, I mean, I would agree. We had similar examples, and I think the cases can be very different. They can be ones where people have had a relationship as a neighbour or a friend or a business partner or something, and it's broken down. But there are also lots and lots in volume terms of cases that are about somebody not paying a fuel bill and a big company being the pursuer and trying to be consistent, or, you know, meet targets for recovery and all these sorts of things. And what mediation allows you to do is get some of those out into the open. So just that, I hesitate to use empowerment again, but just that chance to speak about things and fix it. Again, these evaluations of the North American court schemes, the thing that came bottom of the list in terms of the parties' priorities as surveyed and reported on was self-determination. Now, that's a term that we all use in the context of mediation theory and practice and the like, but the parties don't interpret it in that way. They just want something fixed and to be able to move on, whether that's moving on as friends or just moving on. So I've become increasingly concerned about trying to separate the language of the theory and the process from what people want, and, you know, the personal motivations, whether you're there as an individual disputant or you're there as the debt manager of the gas company.
Thank you. The next question, I think you've kind of touched upon this already, but I wonder if either of you want to expand. So with the change from opt-in to opt-out in small claims, it would not have been surprising to see the case numbers increase and yet they remain level. Is there any link to the argument for voluntary versus mandatory model for mediation?
Sue?
I've been arguing for mandatory mediation for a really long time because I feel, you know, I've said already that I feel this is about a shift in culture, that it's not about adding something on to an existing system. And so if it's something that we want to embrace, and I think we've been talking all the way through this session around different approaches about, you know, encouraging it to be a focus on the users rather than litigation and a judge, and so I think, you know, that is a shift that we have to decide to embrace, and that where that has happened elsewhere, then you know, that there have been, it isn't only, well, there's more mediations, it actually is about complete change really to the litigation process. And I suppose I think that with the growth of online, that might happen anyway. So I don't know that it is anymore really about voluntary or mandatory, because I have seen, and in British Columbia, they've got a small claims online service now that is designed around advice at the front end. It then goes through a mediation process, and if you don't settle, you end up with a judge. Now, that's not mandatory or not mandatory, it's a process, and you just go through each step. And I think that's probably more the way that we're going to go, rather than saying right now you have to go to mediation. It's just, this is a step on a process, a bit like, you know, any other step in terms of litigation. So we'll just have to see how that grows. The technology itself becomes the mediator.
Great, thank you. And just one last thing, again, it's about language. And there was a comment made, let me just find, Liz Stocco a few years ago found that describing mediation in doctrinal terms, as we tend to do, was a turn-off for the layperson, and that using functional descriptions worked better for uptake. Does that kind of concur with what you found? And do you want to expand upon that at all?
I think it's in part what we found, and in part what has been emerging ever since. That the doctrinal language is not necessarily helpful in embedding mediation into a litigation process, for example. As Sue has said, if it becomes part of the pathway, if it's seen as something everybody does, if it's an option that could be helpful, that to me is better than even the opt-in, opt-out language, where people feel they're being pigeonholed into one thing or another, and that's almost judgmental in itself. So normalizing things to be part of just what happens if you've got a dispute is, in my view, better. But there I am using lots of doctrinal and jargony language, but if it's just something that you do and it'll work or it won't, then